I think it's 5 o'clock. We have 230 people in the meeting, which is, I think, more than we expected. As we said, initially this was planned as, we had a discussion in the group about how to do evaluations, how to do our research while we cannot really get to the users. And yeah, this discussion grew bigger when we figured out it's not just us, it's quite a number of people who had been sort of toying with the idea of what to do, how to do research. And then we said, oh, let's just do sort of an online meeting where we really talk about experiences. So Florian and I, who are hosting this meeting today, we have been sort of playing around with a list of things we can tell our PhD students to do. We have put a PDF up, and I think this is at this point a working paper. We hope more ideas are coming in, and we are sort of trying to, we post at some point in the chat, I think we post just the link to the PDF, and this is really, this is a very rough sketch, but it's mainly, the idea was to have for our labs, the idea of what can you do as alternatives, and hopefully more alternatives come out today. So what we have planned now, we have a number of people who have done certain areas, certain directions, and we give them each 2 minutes. And what you have seen here, what's working only sort of well with a background, because the background sort of subtracts my timers. So what I'm doing, we said people have 2 minutes, so I put a 3-minute clock off on for the introductory round, and if people go over those 3 minutes, we will switch the micro off. So you have 2 minutes, but we have sort of, because online things are harder. And I'm just basically opening the web page. I put the web page in the chat. Oops. So I put the web page in the chat, and I will start from the very top, and I will give my statement last. So we have Anna. Anna is at ETH in Zurich. Yeah, I got to read her thesis when we selected sort of the best theses of HCI. And she has a way of not dealing with the user. She does it computational. And I think I put a timer up for you, Anna, please.
All right, yeah, thanks for having me and for introducing me, Albert. Nice to take part in this. And I'm gonna open with a maybe a pretty bold statement to foster discussions around you. If we don't have access to users, why don't we just simulate them? And I think, so to what extent can we do that today? I think we don't need to be very exact as we maybe fear we need to be to doing that in order to evaluate a user interface or to design a good user interface. And I think even today we could be really close to that already. We have some pretty good methods to understand users and their needs, mostly qualitative, also quantitative, but it's quite challenging to then actually turn those observational data and experiences or gut feelings about what makes a good or bad interface into quantifiable and computable criteria that could then be used with algorithms together to design interfaces. I want to very quickly point out an example from my research. We applied such a method. So I like to apply optimization methods to the design of user interfaces, and we've pretty successfully done that to design together with the French government a new keyboard standard for them. Where we essentially took a lot of knowledge from literature, from our own study on typing, and made mathematical functions that could be used to generate different keyboards and automatically evaluate how good a person could type on them. And that was, to some extent, enough to design a new standard for the French population that could satisfy lots of different constraints, because we have such a huge design space. There's no way we can try out many different keyboards. Of course, simulating a user builds on existing studies. So I'm not saying we don't need to run any studies, and anymore. But I claim that there are many, many great observational studies out there that wait for us to be turned into actionable knowledge that could be used by algorithmic methods like optimization to automate at least a part of the UI application, the design of UI and applications. And I'm very open for ideas, discussions, or collaborations on what kind of methods we could use to do that, from reinforcement learning to data science methods and optimization. I think there's much possible from the CS point of view here. So I'm done.
Okay, that's less than 3 minutes. Thank you. And I think we move on with the opening statements. And the next on my list is Niels Hense. I have been working with Niels a number of years. And I think the first time he tried to basically put a study out to 10,000, 20,000 people, I figured that's not going to go well, but it seemed he made a career out of it. So please, Niels, and I turn the clock. You are muted.
Does it still count against the clock?
Yes.
What a pity. Yeah, I think as researchers, we always have to cope with limited resources. I mean, different universities have different resources, right? And we have to deal with it. So when I moved to Regensburg, there was no VR lab. So we had to set it up, and that took a while. So we had to deal with not having a VR lab. I think the main difference is that it affects all of us at the same time. And so we all have to deal with it at the same time. But when we do that, we shouldn't compromise validity. So I think that's the main point. So we shouldn't start yet another useless online survey, but think about how can we do studies now with the resources that we have at hand. And I think there are a lot of opportunities. Many people have a lot of free time, for example, at the moment. And I think you can still bring your study to your participant. And we did a lot of mobile HCI by deploying apps on app stores, and that still works. You can do similar things with VR nowadays. You can build interesting prototypes using the web. You could start studying video conferences. Build your own video conference that's better than what we use at the moment. So I think there's a lot of things you can do, and there are lots of studies that you can do. You just have to think about what you do, and you have to deal with the limited resources that you have at the moment.
Okay, I think that was fairly quick. So I have now sort of to switch my counters. Because then the other one isn't run through. So the next one is Ville, and he had, or he would have had to present a paper at Hawaii this year, where he looked into how to run user studies in VR. So basically really sort of taking this out. And I think this was done before we didn't have access to the user. It was for different reasons. So Ville, are you online? Yes, I see you.
Yep.
And I
Can you
give
hear
you
me?
3 times this clock.
All right. Okay. So hello, everyone. Good afternoon. As Albert mentioned, my name is Ville. And in this panel, I want to propose virtual reality as a platform for running user studies to generate knowledge on real-world phenomena. I think VR has tremendous potential for this purpose because it allows us full control over the environment and situation, allowing us to change conditions and variables at will. I think VR is particularly valuable for studies that are very difficult to set up in the real world. And now, of course, with the COVID-19 outbreak, I believe VR as a study tool is especially valuable. So there are many reasons why we might want to run user studies in virtual reality. The million-dollar question, of course, is whether studies run in VR will produce ecologically valid results. In other words, if we run a study in VR, then are the results the same than if we had conducted the same study in the real world? This is a complex issue, and there are challenges, especially with current technology and current perceptions of VR, and probably not all studies can be run in VR. That being said, I think with clever study design, there are many studies where VR is a valid research tool. For example, we had some promising results in our recent CHI paper, as Albert mentioned. The title is Virtual Field Studies, Conducting Studies on Public Displays in Virtual Reality. In this paper, as the title suggests, we investigated the feasibility of conducting field studies in VR in the context of public interactive displays. To achieve this, we built a virtual replica of an existing semi-public space, and then we ran 2 identical sets in the of studies in the real world and in the virtual world. And we found that our virtual field studies resulted in largely similar results than their real world counterparts. So in conclusion, I think VR has great potential as a platform to run user studies. And in this panel, I'm happy to discuss the extent of this potential as well as the current challenges and limitations.
Okay, thank you. And the next on my list is Sarah. She is at Munich, a PhD student, and she worked with Mechanical Turk. And a lot of things work out, but not everything. So I'm back to this clock. Sarah, the floor is yours.
Yeah, hi, thank you, Albrecht. First of all, for those of you who don't know Mechanical Turk, it offers a very large and diverse workforce, which can be used to get human intelligent tasks done for a rather small amount of money. And despite there is some criticism, several studies have examined that Mechanical Turk provides a relatively diverse sample and valid data. So typical tasks for Mechanical Turk are answering surveys, labeling tasks for machine learning, or data cleaning. Since all communication with mTurk workers is completely online, you can use mTurk during the corona pandemic. Yet I would carefully consider if and how your data may be impacted by the current situation. So as with other remote approaches, mTurk data might be distorted by the very particular circumstances that people are currently experiencing. So for example, if you're asking participants about their emotions, it may not yield representative data at the moment. If you think that your research question is not affected by the current situation, mTurk may be a good source to easily recruit participants. Although it is often said that mTurk is rather quick and cheap, my personal experience is quite different. So if you're thinking, yeah, let's do this just a week before CHI, that's probably not such a good idea. So paying participants adequately to not exploit their workforce can become quite expensive, actually. And there has been a lot of discussion in the CHI community about this. And moreover, while the data acquisition is indeed really fast, the study preparation takes a significant amount of time, and I personally underestimated this. So for example, one common problem with mTurk workers is that should be addressed is character misrepresentation. So that is that workers deceitfully claim an identity to qualify for a specific task due to economic reasons. So for example, stating that they are in a specific age group. This may now be a particular challenge that a lot of people face financial problems. A common strategy to avoid this is building up a pool of reliable mTurk workers. And I would argue if you're planning to conduct mTurk studies in the future and you have now a little bit time left, building up this pool could be a worthwhile task right now. And if you want to know how to do this, how to set up a reliable pool, yeah, feel free to contact me, and I can also forward you some papers which describe this process. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So the next on my list, as I see, is Antonio. And I think we were in a meeting when we discussed that we should do that. And the short thing Antonio wanted to say is, why really bother with user studies? They haven't helped anyone anyway. And I think you have a few more seconds to explain this in more detail.
Yeah, thank you very much. Hello to everybody, good afternoon. And before I'm diving into this, let me first disclaim that, of course, studies are super important and very helpful in many cases. You know, I run studies in my lab every year to basically get all the contributions grounded. Yeah. But having said this, you know, we all know also that a study doesn't equal study. You know, there are well-run studies, there are not so well-run studies, and there are many flawed studies, yeah, of course. And my impression is a little bit that for those that currently have worked on contributions that require lab studies, it will be hard to shift them online, yeah, without kind of compromising validity. That's a big issue. There are, of course, lots of possibility to run online studies. There are good questions that you can answer with fieldwork. There are good questions that you can answer with app-based, basically, surveys and all these kind of progress that we've seen from a methodological point of view in the last years. But in the end, let's face it, most at least of my studies, I cannot run online. It's nearly impossible. Because they involve some sort of prototypes that you need to test or so, yeah. And the question is what to do about this. And my answer would be drop the study, yeah. So either your prototype is good enough, that it basically doesn't need kind of a study to be interesting, to present a good idea, yeah. I know that the Kai community in particular always had struggled a little bit with this point of view. This in the end also led to the development and flowering actually of the WISC community, who basically started off exactly along this path to say, let's concentrate on the technology. It has to be good enough to stand alone without actually, is this a 3 minute? Yeah, I still have there's lots of screen, but maybe it's a delay actually of my video, yeah? So it's this real time. So what I believe is just rethink whether you really need a study. There might be also another more fundamental issue for next year's Kai, and that is actually having equal grounds in terms of who can run kind of a meaningful study and who cannot, which would also ask, in my opinion, for a special track that is basically study-free. That would be my point.
Okay, thank you. And you used up the extra minute. The next person on my list is Sarah, but this time Sarah Brange, who talks a little bit about implementing interactive surveys. And she's a PhD student at Florian's group in Munich at the University of the Armed Forces.
Hey, yeah, thanks for the introduction. I'm in my PhD working on usable security for smart homes, which means that I'm in general interested in getting data from users in their homes. And within this panel, I would like to have some more positive words on online surveys, because I recently experienced that online surveys can be much more powerful than just simple questions. So what we have at our institution is an installation of SOSKey, which is an online survey tool, which basically allows to add like interactive parts of code within the online survey. And what we did is using this to implement like an interactive online version of a physical prototype to send this out to a large amount of users, which then allowed us to have like, on one hand, a clickable prototype online, and then on the other hand, also have like usual online survey questions together with that. And I think that's a really powerful tool. It may, of course, not work for each and every use case, but for me, it worked quite well, and I'm happy to discuss this within this panel.
Okay. Thank you. So the next person on my, oops, it's gone. Oh. So Florian is the next person I see on my list.
All right. So there is also Luke, I think, but I'm happy to
oh, sorry. Then so Luke. Sorry, I was just basically my browser killed itself. So we go first for Luke. Luke is in Canada at the moment. Most of the time he's in Munich, but I think due to the current circumstance, he is in another place. And he is also sort of going for, can we buy online users? And please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, so I think, as Neil said, we don't want just another useless online survey, but I have been having some good experiences with online surveys and also Mechanical Turk, as Sarah talked about. So I think it's important at the start to think about how you can actually make useful surveys and think about the limitations of them and what questions they can actually answer. But so what I've been doing is finding out user preferences and behaviors. We're also doing a scenario-based survey, and soon we'll be implementing a video-based survey. So there are some ways you can get creative to kind of get some better feedback. But one thing that was mentioned in the Twitter announcement for this event was that we don't want to be bombarding users at home who might be really stressed and be exploiting them, because sometimes they're at home and they're really not in a good situation. So I think one of the ways to get around this is to use something like Mechanical Turk, where you're getting input from users who are sitting at home specifically looking to do surveys for money. So it's kind of a way that I don't feel like I'm exploiting the users. Also, I've been able to get really, really quick responses. So like 60 responses to a survey in an hour. And something that Zara brought up that has also been mentioned in the Mechanical Turk community itself is paying fair wages. So academic surveys in particular have kind of a bad reputation in the Mechanical Turk community for not paying fair wages. And I think this is something that we have to watch out for. So you have to kind of look at how long your task is going to take and really think about a fair wage. And we don't want to be exploiting people. So I've made sure to do that. And as long as you pay a fair wage, you can get some pretty good responses. Something important too is that people will, create bots or just click through your survey as fast as they can, and you can get some not great answers. So it's important to set up some mandatory, like either attention checks or some short answer questions where people have to actually type something. And it's really obvious if someone types something incomprehensible, then you can just reject those results. But it's also really obvious when people have actually put some time into your survey. So far my experience has been positive about it, and I am happy to talk more about the experience of running surveys through Mechanical Turk, and I'll be running a couple more in the future for some different projects that we're working on. But yeah, that's it so far.
Okay, thank you. And I think this brings up one other point we need to discuss. Basically, how do we check validity of methods? I think our community has gone over the last 20 years. I look back in some of the old CHI papers, has gone through an incredible transformation and how critical we are on studies. So just pick out the proceedings from 2000, take a random study and compare it to nowadays. And I think for all the other domains, we are probably not yet there understanding what good methods are, how they look like, or at least we don't have an agreement across the community. But I think we have one more. Florian, now is yours.
Thank you, Albrecht. Yeah, my name is Florian. I'm an HCI researcher with a particular focus on usable security. I'm also based in Munich, working at the Research Institute for Cyber Defense, which is part of the University of the German Federal Armed Forces. So I've previously done much research in two seemingly very different areas. The first one, where I worked on my PhD, is interaction with large public displays, and the second one is novel security mechanisms. But if you look at them from a methodology perspective, both are actually quite closely related, because both of them require, on one hand, research in very controlled settings. For example, if you want to investigate a particular attack vector. But then on the other hand, also in settings where people behave very naturally, where we want to put out prototypes for people to use them in their everyday life. And now, having this said, what we often see is that on one hand, we as researchers, so what we are doing is often limited on one hand by the research methods we are familiar with, and on the other hand, by the environment and by the user groups to which we have access. But then on the other hand, what I think is that the most exciting and insightful research papers we have are those that actually complement insights we obtain in the lab with knowledge that we obtain in uncontrolled settings. And then also where we sort of come up with new methods, where we combine new methods, where we take methods and use them in a way in which we did not use them before. And now with the current situation that we are facing, I hope that we will all be able to greatly benefit from our ability, and I mean the ability of the entire HCI community, to be creative with regard to the methods that we employ. And in particular, I think we should not just look at which methods are at the moment seemingly easy to apply, but still let our research be driven by what we are excited about and what we are interested in, and rather come up with novel research approaches. And then also this entails, of course, understanding which research questions work and which don't. And that was also part in this, this work that Wille talked about, where we looked into VR as one possible novel tool that we could use. And I saw that this already triggered a lot of discussion in the chat. So I think, yeah, That will be very interesting. And yeah, that would be my statement. We should not just sort of limit ourselves to what we currently can do, but still sort of let the methods, let the research question define the method we use and not the other way around.
Okay, so I'm last, and I have a very short statement before we go into the discussion, and I think the chat is running quite well, so I think we'll pick them from the chat. So my statement, which I put on the webpage, is I think we have a lot of people who have figured out stuff and have not gotten around to consolidate what they have understood. And so I think this, in some areas, we have vision papers or consolidated papers. And in other disciplines, that's quite common, that if you have done your 5 or 10 papers or have had a number of PhD students on a topic, that you try to write a deeper insight, and not necessarily a book. That could be quite a short paper where you really condense the insight. And I think taking this time, not running for the next study and not running for the next Chi paper, but really saying, I'm consolidating this into 5 pages, into a chapter, into a tutorial, like sort of synthesis of our own and the community's work. I think this could be something we could be spending time on. And I think with this, I take the clock away. And I think now we do the experiment. We are still at nearly 300 people. We are streaming it on Twitch because I think we were overrun. So I go into the first question that was also the one for Anna's presentation. And I'm not sure if Michael Müller, could you put a question in audio? Let's try if this works. I can't see you on the screen, but there are 12 screens with faces. So Michael, are you online? Can you post the question directly?
Yes, thank you. I would love to do that.
Oh, perfect.
Thanks for your lovely presentation. I learned a great deal. And my question comes from a history of cognitive modeling. Bonnie John and I have been discussing, maybe debating is the right word, within the context of our friendship for many years, what her version of cognitive modeling is good for, called GOMS or GOMS CPM. And it seems to me that it is mostly for tasks which are very routine and very, very, very well practiced. And that was in the early 1990s. Time has changed. And so my question to you is, will your kinds of modeling techniques or working from simulated models work for less routine tasks, less well-practiced tasks, and therefore potentially more dynamic, unanticipated tasks? And I should stop talking now and allow you to talk. Thank you so much.
Yeah, that's a great question. Of course, there's a lot of history in HCI and kind of community on using user models, simulating users. I think where we are today with breakthroughs in machine learning with more powerful computing powers, we can delve in a space of online modeling, also personalization, where we have seen work also in our group at ETH, where we model, for example, online the gaze behavior of people to dynamically change the user interface. And yeah, I think there are lots of very interesting methods that we can apply now that were not possible in the 90s. That go, I mean, routine behavior to some extent, that things like, for example, decision-making are very well practiced by us, and thus routine tasks, but probably have not been tackled to that extent by things like more motor routine behaviors like typing or clicking. So yeah, I think there's lots of new opportunities today.
Thank you. This is very inspirational. Thanks.
Okay, so thank you so much for starting off the discussion. Perhaps one thing with the discussion, just introduce yourself quickly with 1 or 2 sentences, because I think it's really hard to keep track who is. I see that Erich Latoszek, a colleague from not too far from Munich, from Würzburg. Are you here? You were sort of quite critical on how well the whole VR thing is going to work. And I know you're one of the people probably most knowledgeable in this space, so we should probably listen. Are you online? Can you put the question forward?
Yes, I can. Hi. Maybe we can also enable my video.
Yes.
Is it working? I don't know.
Yes.
So yes, my name is Mark Latoszek from Würzburg University, and the discussion about the validity of virtual reality as an experimental tool in the first place, and then also as an environment for usability tests, is very similar. And if you see the literature of the last years and even decades, I don't know, every 5 years or so, people say VR is a controlled environment. That is not true. Sorry to spoil your promises here, unless we control the timing of our computer systems completely, unless we control things like brightness, contrast, field of view, 100%, only to name a few of the impacts that we can have on the perceptual side on users, this is not a controlled environment. You might render the same stuff in different headsets. It turns out that measures like presence, for example, or others turn out to show a difference. Same is true if you change the timing, for example. So please don't say that. Half of the papers don't even report on, for example, the temporal aspects of the simulations. If they do report it, they still report the old crap, meaning some average numbers of latency, which tells you nothing about how your experience really worked over time. Taking a sample up front before you put users in a VR, even if you take the sample 3 times, is just a very, very broad estimation of, for example, what your simulation does once the user enters it. So in my personal view, I love VR, but I still say we are not there to really say it's a valid method to do this experimental research and also a valid message for usability research.
So thank you so much. This is the 2-minute timer for the max question length. So I think this is for Ville, and I think the question is your paper that's going to be published wrong? Or is sort of what Mark said, does it apply to a certain type of research? Where can we apply it and where can't we apply it? And what does validity mean? Can you take a shot at it?
So there are certainly exactly these types of challenges and limitations with VR systems as a whole, and especially when it comes to running user studies. So let me clarify what I meant when I talk about full control, not really full. I agree with that notion, but so basically what I mean is what normally is a physical space is in VR, it's essentially just software, right? So if I go back to my example of studying audience behavior around public displays in VR, we can do anything we want with the layout of the space, the location of the display in question, the size and whatnot. So things that really are very expensive, time consuming, or even simply impossible to do in the real world. So by control, I mean that we can do these things that are really not very feasible in real world studies.
So is there somebody else who wants to give one more comment on VR? I think I've seen a number of people. Mohammed is around, who was collaborating in the study. You want to sort of have another word why you think the paper is still valid and Mark maybe not right?
Can I chip in with one more comment, by the way?
Yes.
So in our paper, so our motivations were quite different to this COVID-19 outbreak. So in our study, we did invite participants in the lab. So we, in that sense, we did have control over the software, over the displays and the equipment, etc., and the tracking space and so forth. So this is perhaps more particular to this situation where we don't have that luxury of inviting people over and being in control of the study setting. Mohammed, please go ahead.
Yeah, hi everyone. So this is Mohammed from the University of Glasgow. You can see it here in the background. Yeah, so in terms of using VR for user studies, so I think, so as Ville said, like when using VR, you save a lot of costs. You also actually are able to reach out to people who are not able to come to your lab. about the validity, I think that's actually an ongoing question. And for sure, VR will not be, or like, let's call them VR studies. They're not like an alternative to each and every other, research methodology out there. So basically, we need to first understand which research questions could be addressed in VR and which require, like, wouldn't be addressed without the actual study. Because, for example, you cannot use a questionnaire for each and every research question, right? You cannot use a lab study for each and every research question. I think that VR is very valuable as a research tool, and it makes deployments much easier. It makes it easier to reach for people who are not able to come to your lab, etc. So I think we need to investigate further what can we do with VR, because it's it would be, I would say it would supplements or supports our other methodologies. So it's not an alternative. It's helpful in addressing certain questions.
Okay, so I think I'll cut this short, because I think we have a lot of new questions coming in, and so I think I would be just reading out 2 or 3 comments, and we may come back later. So I think one of the questions, I think that's also linking what Mark and Ville and Mohamed said. I think the question is, if we run VR outside the lab, I think we know that people may have really not the technologies to do it, and that we have trouble getting things. And I think people have suggested you can ship something like cardboard of a certain phone. I think this is something, I think this is sort of quite an important one. And I think for me, one of the questions is really, do we get to this point that we have enough things that we can do research? I would go to one other question, I think that links in a way to it, is Kata. Are you online? Is Kata online? Otherwise, I read it out.
She says she can't get her sound running.
Okay, so then I just read it out. So it's about sort of unequal access of technologies, of capabilities. So small children at home, you basically, I just read it, I think that's the best thing. Considering unequal access to technological artifacts and networking capabilities, as well as having the resources, the mind space to donate free to the time to research, how can we avoid marginalization effects? So how do we make sure we include really the people we want? So I think the people who are now bored and at home, maybe not necessarily our users we have in mind. And I think it's the other side of this question. Usually we take students. In psychology and computer science, we mainly test on students, if you look back, and now we test on people who are bored at home. Is this sort of, that is one question about marginal, but also the access of technology. Who wants to take a step at that? Anna.
Maybe I see it actually as an opportunity to actually reach people that we otherwise don't reach as easily, especially if we talk about alternatives now, online alternatives. I mean, we know about this weird thing in HCI, Western educated, whatever else it stands for, more represented people in our HCI studies. But we have also already seen that, for example, through online service, through large-scale online studies, we can actually reach a much larger population, and maybe with some resampling, we can make that a little bit more representative. And I think the methods that we discuss here actually give us new opportunities, and now we need to rethink that to go outside of our university and reach some more people. So I think that's actually a great opportunity to get rid of that problem.
But that people who don't have the access to technology, people who may not have sort of, so I think one of the things we realized even with students, some of them have contracts with data limits. So they cannot be online, especially now, because usually they would go to the cafe, they would go to university. So quite simple things. How does this impact us? I think, Niels, you had looked at some point into sort of how we pick things, especially sort of, I think, the mobile HCI community. So how do you think is this sort of, is there a way around?
I don't know, but I think, well, if we now say, oh yeah, this is so problematic because if we do these studies online, then not all people can have access to these studies. I mean, the question. I mean, the studies that we do, there are papers on that at CHI. There are papers at other conferences that tell us what you just said. That most of the studies are conducted with, I don't know, people that love technology and are typically our students. So I think one factor is we will probably, if we do run studies now, we will probably get a better sample. Maybe not if we go for Mechanical Turk, but if we do some kind of online study, we will probably get a better sample of the population than doing the standard lab study that we typically do. But I think Kata's other aspect that she mentioned, what do we do if we now try to get access to people that actually are in difficult situations at the moment? I think that's a more interesting one because I don't have an answer for that one. But I think for the sample is so bad, I think that's not, I mean, if you ask that now, why didn't you ask that beforehand?
Okay, I think I move on, and Eva Honecker has been putting up a few points that are really interesting, and I will start with one. I think the co-design, the participatory design question. How do we get there? Where are sort of the ways of doing that? Eva, are you online? Can you elaborate on that a bit?
That's basically the point where we are currently with the project, where we had intended to do co-design sessions or focus groups with elderly people age 70 up. We'll be looking into doing something online, but that limits us to a much smaller group, plus to people who already use Skype. So that means it will, by definition, be a much more technology-savvy subgroup. And talking with people who are in churches and dealing with the elderly groups of Gemeinden, of churches. They say that even the people who are active, usually you can only telephone them up and nothing else. So that's really an impasse at the moment where, yeah. And I think that's also for a lot of other topics, that's an issue where we have to get really creative if you want to get anything done. On the other hand, what's slightly easier is if you do it online, you're not restricted to people in your direct vicinity. So maybe we can actually get more people, but the sample will be much more skewed than if we would be able to do it locally and just go into a local church for the coffee meeting.
I think also this question about qualitative, quantitative, that I think goes into this point. I think sort of very much what we look at the moment replacing, and I think also a lot of the discussions we had in the lab were about replacing very quantitative work in the study. And I think that's quite an important point, that the qualitative work is also something we didn't even consider as part of the panel. So I think it's really good that you brought that up.
If I can add to that, so one of the things that we know is that in like qualitative interviewing, it's really important to listen closely, to react to the person and so on. And a lot of the cues that you need for that might get lost or be much more difficult in a remote environment if you're trying to interview people there. So it will require much more skill than before.
And I think a lot of the video technologies, audio technologies are really not yet there to really make it easy to pick up that cue, especially if you have no control on the side of your user. I jump one more. Rosemary Thomas Is she here? Are you here?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, so please.
Hello. Yes, I had done Amazon Turk studies initially during my PhD because my supervisor thought it's the easiest way to get maximum number of people. So I did that for a couple of studies, but that was like normal questionnaire kind of studies. But later when it got complicated and I had validation questions, I did a sample study with around 50 participants, or almost 95% of them just screwed up the whole study, just randomly clicking through everything. And I had been faced with abuse as well, like, why aren't you paying me? Then when I got back to them and showing that you answered these validation questions wrong, they were like, okay, fine, we were distracted and stuff. But when I pulled off the study and conducted the same study on like sharing it in Twitter and Facebook. The sample was much more better with better results. And they were doing the validation questions because they actually wanted to do the study, not for the money. So it's to the panel who have been working with Amazon Turk, and how do you like kind of work with these kind of people on Mechanical Turk where you cannot really understand?
So I have one thing to do with that, and it's actually not as much about working with the people on Mechanical Turk, but I've just posted the same survey both on Mechanical Turk and through more traditional methods, like sharing it through social media and stuff. And so far I've been comparing the answers as they come in for my own purposes of planning on validating the survey results on Mechanical Turk. And so far, maybe it's been lucky, but I actually have gotten good results through, and the results are pretty well the same from both methods. But I do find that it's you do have to just reject the ones that are giving you incomprehensible answers. But basically running it through the two parallel streams, I think so far has been a good way of validating it.
Yeah, because I tried it. I was like, I couldn't be like, you have to give explanation by, and it's so much of time. You have to pay them, you have to give them reasons. So if you don't pay them, it's so much of manual effort than just sharing it. If you're just sharing it online, we just kick off the people who didn't do it correctly. That'll be a minority, and you don't have to give explanations why if you're not using them. I've just found that Amazon Turk had been too much consumption of mental and physical energy.
In our study, we also used different attention checks to make sure that the data is valid. And we also defined beforehand in our instructions for the Mechanical Turk workers that we will only accept people who fulfill a specific amount of attention checks. And I think that most people answered the attention checks correctly, but there are also some opportunities now in Mechanical Turk that you, for example, only allow master users, which are users who have already have had so many good tasks completed. So this will allow you to know which might be more reliable. But we also had the problem that even if we defined those criteria at the beginning, that we will exclude participants who have not answered the attention checks correctly, we had a lot of problems with them then getting a lot of hate mails from people who have not done it correctly. So I would agree that maybe for like a sample size of 50, you can easily distribute it among other communities, but if you're having bigger samples, this makes it more difficult. But in general, some studies suggest that the level of attention in Mechanical Turk workers is even higher than in, for example, other convenient sampling methods like college students, because they're very much trained on answering these questions. But I would also agree that there are some problems associated with this.
So do you think using the master level and certain qualifications makes the study more expensive?
Yes, that's definitely makes it more expensive. You have to pay more then.
Thank you, Sarah and Luke.
But what would be another possibility is that you are trying to find your own MTurk workers who are reliable in like multiple studies. But this is of course only worth it if you're planning to do this several times.
Thank you very much.
I think this is an interesting point, and I think perhaps there's somebody in the audience. I think there has been discussion whether we need something like a something similar to Mechanical Turk for science, because I think other disciplines have built up things where people can contribute to science, be it either by image classification. I think there are a lot of portals out there now in biology and chemistry, in medicine, where people can contribute to research. And usually those tasks are a bit more complex than your average task. Does anybody in the audience have experience with having sort of style citizen science approach where you ask people to really contribute to your research in order to either sort of evaluate or do something like this? Do we have somebody who has experience at their university or their school, at their company, to build something like this up? Okay.
Can I speak?
Yeah, please.
So I've done, this is Helen Petrie. I'm from the University of York in the UK. And I've done studies with Mechanical Turk, and I've done studies with citizen science platforms that exist in the UK. And I'm not sure that the citizen science platforms are that much better. When we started with Mechanical Turk, we did have the kind of problems that were described of being in effect spammed, but we've found that if you put attention questions and you carefully screen your participants and only take master workers, we've now done quite well. And I've done studies, as was discussed earlier, where I've compared results from a volunteer student sample and from the Mechanical Turk sample, and we've got exactly the same results. But it's not an easy solution, as was mentioned. It's a lot of work, and you do get a few people who send you hate mail. So I've had to support my PhD students through the hate mail. But I think a crowdsourcing platform for HCI would be a really interesting idea. That would be something that might come out of our current situation that we could all work on together, which would be great.
Thank you, Helen, for this insight. And I think you mentioned the emotional cost. I think that's something with a lot of remote things which we don't see. And I think that's something to really keep in mind also when supervising remotely. I think this is another thing. When we are in the lab, we get we see if PhD students are upset or from running the studies, which we may at the moment not see if they're remote. So I think this is also something that with our fellow workers, we are less aware of the emotional toll it takes to run studies. So I think that's a really important point we didn't have in our initial one. Thank you for that one.
And if I can just add one more small point, you also have to be very careful if you put a study out, an online study out onto your social media contacts, because twice I've had the experience of emailing my colleagues and saying, I have this online study, could you do it? Could you ask your students to do it? And then you lose control of where it goes. And we had the experience where we think someone in California wrote a bot to answer our online questionnaire. And within 24 hours, we had over 1,000 responses, which were all nonsense. And it took me 17 hours of work to clean the data. So be careful also with publicizing through your social media contacts at the moment.
This is Michael. May I return to the theme of citizen science for a moment?
Yes, please.
Yep.
Thank you. I've not done citizen science, but I've studied it because of the kinds of data labeling, feature engineering things that we're looking at in IBM research. One of the things that happens in citizen science is that the motivation model may be different. It's often people who are very enthusiastic about a topic. The group that I know the most about would be bird watchers. And interestingly, if we think about citizen science as stratified between the professional scientists and the lay or citizen scientists, actually in bird watching, there are additional layers in there between the people who go out into their yard and say, I saw a robin, different in the UK from the United States, different robin, and the people who are actually local experts, or in fact experts on certain species because they've been bird watching for 20 years. And so it's a different kind of lay or citizen expertise that comes in, I think very different from paid work in Mechanical Turk. And so I'm not saying one is better than the other. I'm saying these are distinct cases, and it's probably worth thinking about what kinds of distinct cases each of us needs in their research, in each person's research project.
That's a very, very valid point. So do we have responses to this? Otherwise, I'm a bit sort of conscious of time. So I would move on to another bigger topic. I think there was some discussion around what Antonio said, and I think Florian Michaelis, I'm not sure if he is around. Are you around, Florian?
Yes, I'm here. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, so please. So you had sort of a response to Antonio.
Yeah, so I actually wanted to confirm what Antonio said, that of course, depending on the research, if it's about confirming, investigating a very specific approach, like in our case, I'm working for Siemens here in Berkeley, heading a small research group where we develop new ideas and new concepts for example, manufacturing or building management places. So it's not just that the users, in our case, should play with our prototype, which is specific technology that we have developed, but it's also about a specific environment. So people that are in a manufacturing environment, and not are these people usually far away from us, they're also not really accessible because they have work to do. They don't want to waste time and do a study. So the workarounds I was proposing here is to have the prototype standing out as the contribution, but then explaining the prototype, maybe filming the prototype, showing a YouTube video of that, and then at least grab the experts for a short interview and do more like an expert interview or a focus group study, but not to do a full user study because there may not be the time and there may not be the access to that. And that was my comment here.
I think with this point Antonio made, I think looking back at the early work in Ubicom, there was a lot of this work where people just built stuff and got away with it. And I think we had recently in our lab Ted Selker around who also talked about the early work. And I think it was quite interesting to see how the research approach was by not asking for an evaluation. I think that the thing was, if you look at it and it's so new that you accept it, it's fine. But are we well beyond this? I think the question is how scientific we have gotten as a community, or if we are sort of, even the design side, if you look at the papers, has got very scientific. So the question is, should we take a step back and say, HCI is not just science, it is science, exploration, design, engineering, and we should all value it. So Antonio, you were in that point. How do we make sure that people are not publishing rubbish if they don't have evaluated it?
Yeah, this is of course a very general question, and currently actually the method is peer reviewing, how we basically make sure that there is no rubbish in our conferences, and we know that's fair enough working method, but there are also other methods to ensure quality. First of all, it's good to see Florian actually. Yeah, we haven't met for a while. Yeah, good to see you. Actually, a compromise could be one suggestion that Florian mentioned, that you try to shift a little bit the evaluation. Another one could be that other disciplines do anyways for certain circumstances, is to just present the study actually and the study design instead of the full evaluation. Yeah? I think this makes also a lot of sense in general. And we might have now the chance to shift a little bit, you know, instead of having the full study plus the results, you save actually resources for the study, and then you promise once the paper has been accepted to run the study and show the results. And in this case now, where we have this problem over the summer, this could easily fix actually a short-term problem that we have, that we just basically present the studies and we promise to publish the results. And this could then, you know, at least for some of us who have these prototypes and need labs and so on, could solve somehow the problem without moving on shaky ground, you know, in terms of validity.
But who would decide?
Yeah, we would decide, the community. You know, this is something we have to make our mind up, I believe. You know? So it's something that, you know, we've had these shifts in how we evaluate actually good work, how we try to decide, you know, what which paper should go in a conference, should gain attention in the end. It's about attention, and which papers don't. You know? So I think this is something we need to discuss, you know, and maybe we find a way, actually, a middle ground, yeah, where we are more open towards these kind of approaches.
So I think one other point that goes with evaluation is reproducibility. I think that has been in the CHI community around for quite a while, that we can reproduce results other people have done, that we can build on other people's work. This obviously doesn't work for all the broad range of work we see in the community, but there is this question about data and data sets that goes with that. And so one of the questions, I think Susanne brought it up in response to Anna. Is Susanne here about data sets?
Yes.
Yes, please.
Okay, hi, thanks. Okay, I'm still struggling with the background, so that's kind of a weird thing in Kai. Anyway, in Zoom. So, well, I think many of the teams have already started collecting data sets, and if you look into other communities, like in the multimedia field, it's actually very common that now data sets are put out into benchmarks or challenges. So there is enough data sets in the field. We have always been discussing if they should be shared and if they can be shared, of course, according to privacy rules. So why don't we consider publishing a data set, a contribution to CHI? And I would also like to remember each of us, if we look at Jacob Warbrock's paper on what the contributions to HCI are, he has 6 types of things we could do. And it's empirical, yes, that's difficult now, but it's artifact, it's methodological, it's theoretical, it's data set, survey, and opinion. So we might also go back to these contribution types and reconsider them, and maybe also as a community evaluate which if we sort of, recently we had a lot of some opinion papers, but most of them were study papers. Maybe for 1 year, at least we switched to something. And so I think different points could come together. Benchmarks and data sets would be one point, and also considering other contribution types, which we as a community have always accepted, and maybe put a stronger focus on them.
Thank you very much. And I think the data set question is really interesting. I just posted sort of a link to a PDF, which I think we should make into a Google Doc at some point that people can contribute. That's something Florian and I put together. And there is also the link, that's why I had this put in, the link to Google dataset search. So Google has now a search engine for data sets, and it's quite interesting to see how many data sets out of other subjects are out there. And I think one of the problems I've seen in our community, we try to make very good or perfect data sets, and then they get never published. So I think also the acceptance that a data set must not sort of the optimal set. So I think this is really the question, how do we get those data sets out? How do they have to look like? And I think, Anna, you created some data set with text input. Can you talk a little bit about sort of the issues of data set creation, and also are there things you would recommend or not recommend?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can try how much there was, but there was right, and you took it maybe over.
Is there somebody speaking? Sorry. Yeah, so I have experience with some data sets, some in relation to text input. I collected data in the lab, more very detailed data with little users, also very large scale data with a lot of users that I collected online. These data sets have been mostly published by on our own project pages and advertised in the community through Kai Talks and stuff like that. And that's why I thumbed up Susanne Ball's idea or request to use this as an opportunity to collect data sets, because I think it's there is no good way, or at least I don't know of a good way to make this more broadly available and more broadly known to people working in similar area, maybe besides some specific community workshops or things like that. So I just tried the Google dataset search and tried for text entry and couldn't find my dataset. I have no idea how it looks for datasets, and I would love to put my dataset in there, of course, but I don't know how it works.
You have to do a meta, you have to write a metadata file. So we looked into it. There is a certain hurdle, but this is sort of a hurdle of 2 hours. Probably, and I think we downloaded a number of data sets, and there are a lot of bad data sets out there. We were really excited reading the explanation, got the data, and it didn't really go that well. But I think it's a good start, and I think having a search engine makes sense. But there is also sort of concerns with data set. And Michael had just put in, especially I think we have heard this from companies. I think we know it from the way we collect data. Especially now with the GDPR, we ask people to give data for a certain purpose. If we put the data out and people use it for a different purpose, and it's still personal data, we may have a problem. But I think, Michael, you had one comment. We jump to Europe, and then I go back in the feed again. Michael?
Thank you. I feel like as an audience member, I am talking much too much, but I appreciate the invitation.
You're on the first screen, you know? I have 12 screens and you happen to be on the first screen.
Oh, you're very kind, and I will try to do this quickly. I'm concerned that if we define good science as replicable science, then we exclude certain domain areas, health, for example, a lot of industry research. We've done work on IBM employee data sets. We're never going to share those. We're never even going to anonymize them and share them. There's too many rules against it, too much risk. The other thing that really, really worries me is what happens to qualitative research, what happens to interpretivist research if we define replicable science as the only good science. Those are other scientific, highly rigorous scientific traditions that in which replicability doesn't make any sense. And so those are concerns. I agree for the quantitative domain where data can be made public, replicability is lovely. For the rest of it, I hope we keep room for everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm sort of trying to scroll through the set of questions. There's a lot of questions going back and forth with the we are. And I'm not just picking a person, I have seen the name a lot. Jan Guggenheimer has been asking a lot of questions, and I haven't even read all of them. So Jan, if you're online, pick one of your questions and let us know. So Jan Guggenheimer, are you still there? Okay, you probably have to lost him.
Is the audio working?
Yes, yes, now we hear you.
Oh, there you go. Zoom is so complicated. I think we had a long discussion with Niels and Mark about the validity of these tools for certain questions. I think they work for certain research questions, but I think the overlying thing that I at the end posted was so there's probably going to be a subset of research questions or contribution types that we have in HCI that are not covered by all these methods we talked about. And the question is how are we going to handle them? So how are we going to handle them in the next review process, for instance? So yeah, I think this was the bigger outcome that we have. So that we will have some solutions for certain research types, and this is the stuff that Antonio said as well. So certain artifacts will live and will work without a research study, but not everything's going to be covered with all these tools we talked about. And should these projects be postponed, or how are we going to handle them in the next review process? So when I'm thinking about going to review for Kai 2021, and there's going to be someone with a study that is weird, but this is going to be the argument we're going to say, oh yeah, this person couldn't conduct a research study with a proper method because of COVID-19.
Do we have a response from somebody in the panel? I think we can leave it also without a response. Then I would jump to another person, and I think sort of it's Amy in the chat, and it was about the economic aspects. Amy, are you here?
Yes.
We can't hear you. It's very
Maybe now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. Yes, now it's perfect.
Okay.
Yes, it's perfect.
It's just that these platforms usually require people to pay, even just a little bit for each participant. And my worries are that if we have, for example, I come from Brazil, and right now the currency difference from dollar or euros, for example, is really high, and it would be harder for us to pay for people from the UK or Europe or the United States as much as they would want or they deserve, just because of this difference in currency. When we work with people from Brazil, it's easier because we pay in the same currency, but this difference might make it a little bit difficult for us to afford during research when we have to pay for the participants.
So I think this is a question that's probably ongoing, not just with paying participants. I think it goes all the way to publication costs, to traveling to conferences, etc. And I think this is sort of a question, how to do research in sort of in a fair way. And I'm not sure do people have ideas how to do that? I think there is obviously sort of this that the whole ecosystem. I think we had this in Kai, the question, if people come from certain areas, it's very, that the cost for attending the conference, the cost for publication, cost for doing research is very different depending where you live. But I think there is no real good answer yet, right? I think one of the things is if you stay in your local ecosystem, it works, but this sort of kills international collaboration.
Yeah, just one point is just because that as this difference has already been going for a long time, people here don't have access to the device. For example, if I run a study in VR, they don't have a VR headset at home. It's very rare for someone to have it as a final consumer. So it restricts us to have to make studies in the lab, as people don't have the equipment at home. And I think it's we as a community we could, like, if we try to do experiments like between two universities, for example, we could do collaborations in a way that my university runs the study from another university, and that university could run a study from my university, and we could do it for free, you know. That would be one solution for this, but I think it's also something to keep in mind when talking about these cross-country experiments. Well, thank you for reading my question and taking it into consideration.
Thank you. I have one more on the side of qualitative research, and its different origin. Mary Gray, are you here? Can you speak? Can you read out or produce the question?
Hey there. Hi, this is Mary Gray. Yeah, I was just commenting that I think listening to the exchange, and I think Antonio, you teed it up, that in many cases the objective of replicability that drives a lot of our conversations, or that we're constantly having to respond to, really don't get us in a conversation about the value of qualitative work as a different way of knowing, a different epistemology. So I think in some cases we're often defending our lack of reproducibility, or certain places where we're lacking our ability to, you know, quote unquote, compete with how quantitative research is done. And it feels like a perfect time, and I think Michael and Amy said similar things, it feels like a perfect time to bring out what's distinct and complementary about qualitative research. We are generating data in dialogue through exchange with people, And that can't be reproduced precisely because in most cases, there's a specific point in time. If I come back next year, I'm in a different context with different people. Even if I'm with the same people, their context has changed. And that's the real value of what we're doing, is that we're bringing something that provides insights that can potentially be transferred. And I love the point of thinking the evaluation of the value of the transferability or even the generalizability of a qualitative insight is really our scholarly community vetting the methodology, the rigor at which we thought about sampling, the ethics of what we're doing. Like all of those feel like the best points of reference for evaluating our contributions, particularly in user studies that even when they're quantitative, often have a qualitative component that is given short shrift in a lot of the conversations with our colleagues focused on quant. So thanks for taking my comment.
I think that's a really interesting point, and I find also this question: what happens with our research? And I think sort of HCI is very specific to this. So it's sort of not the place usually where somebody goes, I have this paper, I implement it in my machine, like we see it in computer vision. If an algorithm is published, somebody takes it. I think it's a field that tells how methods work. And I think that's why sort of the rigor is one big question, and I think for the quality. So I think also thinking, what is our contribution? Why do we publish? And I think some people have said over the last years, CHI has become a benchmark for publication. So basically the outcome doesn't really matter as long as you publish there, which I think I would hate if the community becomes sort of just a benchmark. I think if our output has not this value that people go, and I think I really like what Mary just said, is sort of this, it is sort of, even if we go next year, people have had different technology experiences over the last 12 months. So the result will be different. But without the result in the first place, we would not be there where we are. So I think this is much more complex than in many other fields. And I think that makes it exciting, but at the same time also makes the evaluation quite tricky. Looking at the time, so I just scroll down to the very end to see if there's sort of so I think I'll leave the comments, and I think we probably try out to copy the comments out. We have also recorded some of it. So what I would do now, we have another about 10 minutes. I get the 1 minute clock, and I think we go around the panel sort of, and the question is now, what are you looking into more detail now after you heard what people looked at? And if you only need 10 seconds, what are you looking into more detail in order to sort of do your research while not being able to get to the users? And I think this time I start with Antonio, sort of the old people first.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, so I believe that one point is I still stick to my rethink the study concept. I like the pre-registered study idea. This is something that I will promote, and I will just also discuss this with my PhD students to do this. I think that's one way actually to at least solve some of the problems, at least for our research.
Okay. So, and then I go along sort of, I think we forgot Luke earlier, so I think we put Luke into next.
Yeah, so I think this generally gave me quite a bit of things to think about and some different methods to think about, and especially kind of the populations that you're accessing and who's really answering your questions. In terms of the pre-registering the study, that's actually something that my colleague Francesco and I are looking into doing a paper that will be potentially published in a more psychology based venue. So we were talking about pre-registering a study. So I think that is something that could be really interesting to include more in the HCI community potentially.
Okay, then we move on to Sarah Prange.
Okay, so I very much like the idea of publishing more data sets and looking more into existing data sets. But then on the other hand, I would still be at the point that an online survey can be a powerful tool, not only to be like the main evaluation of something, but still to have some first insights regarding an idea or a concept.
Okay, and I think the next one is Ville, who got basically a lot of strong comments on the VR question. So are you now moving away from VR, doing something completely different?
Yeah, so actually my first comment, or rather a question is there a reasonable way to continue this discussion after this talk show? Because I found it quite overwhelming to try and contribute to the chat discussion while listening to the talks, and I feel like I failed at that. So we can get back to that later. I think generally I just want to clarify that I'm certainly not claiming that virtual user studies are somehow now immediately feasible across the board. It's rather that we have this idea and we know there are some challenges there, but we also know that there's great potential, and the results that we have so far are promising. And I think this sort of a strong exchange here perhaps just goes to show how much room there is for further research in this area.
Okay, and we move on to Sarah Völkel.
Yeah, I would also say that I think a lot of the discussions were about how to improve HCI research in general, and I think I wouldn't go for let's do all studies now just to continue doing studies, but I think when we are having maybe take some time now to think about what are things that we would like to improve as a community, as for example Susanne mentioned with the data sets, or fostering like more pre-registration, which has been done a lot in psychology already. So what can we do now as a community? Can we maybe spend some of our time, which we would usually spend on conducting studies, now into considering these aspects instead of just doing studies for doing studies?
Okay, Niels.
I think what I got from this discussion is looking back at data sets, but probably more likely at our own data sets. So some of them are online, some are not. And I think it might be interesting to look at them again. I'm not sure about how likely it is that I use other people's data sets, because they're typically messy and ours are not. But I think the other thing that I think the discussion confirmed that I would really like to continue VR work now, because I mean, what people discussed, I think you can get a higher validity if you do it at people's home, and maybe you need more participants, but maybe that's worth it.
Okay, Anna.
Yeah, a concept I haven't thought about before, or that I took out from this discussion is which is also going on in the chat, is the citizen science approach, which I don't know how much has been going on in HCI, but which I want to read up on, just as a way to kind of put your own experiments out there, have maybe other people conduct it for you in their own communities, as a way also to reach other people. I think that could be very promising. Maybe not necessarily right now, but maybe in half a year.
Okay, then we are down to the last two, Florian and me. So Florian.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, so I really enjoyed the discussion. There is basically two main aspects that I found quite interesting. The one is, and I just want to comment also on the VR thing because I'm a co-author on this. I think the discussion showed that there is a lot of still unanswered question. And I think it's still very worthwhile to look into this, because there is examples from other research areas where this is a very established method, in particular, for example, in the automotive domain, where we are running studies in VR simulators for many years. So I think certainly, yeah, this is worthwhile to continue. The other interesting thing for me is I will mainly think about what all the things we discussed today basically means for how we are running conferences, in particular in the near future, and what this means specifically for, yeah, how we review papers.
Okay, so I will do sort of a very short end. I think one of the things is we were surprised how many people turned up, and I think we're still at 240. So this was sort of a bit surprising to us that that sort of also when it went over Twitter that it interests a lot of people. But what I take away is that we need to discuss such things with each other, and that this time is as good as any. And I think also something like Zoom, it is not like being in the same room. So I think it also puts up the bigger question, is publication and conference, as we do it in HCI, it's really entangled. Is this the right thing? Or do we need forums where we discuss ideas, where we put things forward, and we need forums that are different for publication? Also, I think the question about what we did today, this discussion, we have one topic, a few people are interested, they discuss with each other. Is this sort of something we should think more in a broader sense, also topic-wise, and not having this once-a-year conference, even if we go back to sort of normal, which I'm not sure if there will be the back to normal. So I think for me, it sort of opened much more. I had this very pragmatic view. I'll learn a little bit what I tell in the next discussion with PhD students. Oh, don't be frustrated, do X, do Y. I think I got a lot on that, and we will put this document, which we earlier put together, we put it online editable. But I think for me, it really raised a much bigger question. How do we exchange? Because I think getting us together, and I think with this time we had people from the US, from Europe, very few from Asia, I think, given the time. But I think this sort of shows that there is a chance to interact, to discuss things, to learn about things that are probably less in the formal way as we did it before. And I think as Ville asked, and some people on the message, will we do something similar? And I think given this discussion today, I guess we should do something similar. And I think the effort in total was very limited. We just got a number of people together who make a statement, and we got people to join in into the discussion. So definitely, and I think this is hopefully sort of a starting point for more. And if you have ideas for topics, if you basically have an idea for a panel, let's discuss it. And I think this time we just basically did random sampling over social media, and it worked at least to sort of we had 300 people at the beginning, and we then put it out on Twitch, and there were some more people on Twitch watching. So I think it is not that hard. And I think also cost-wise, it is our time, it's your time, but I think the cost is minimal of doing something like this. So with this, thank you so much for joining. Thank you, Matthias and Thomas, for running the tech in the background. And thank you for the panel too. I think people had quite